Today is the 2nd of September 2020, and a couple of days ago I read the first part of chapter 6 called Ambassadors Extraordinary. This is from a book called Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. It's written by Stuart Holroyd and was published in 1977. I have been reading up to now the sleeve notes, the forewords, and the chapters 1 to 5 complete, and this is chapter 6. This book is a journey of consciousness and belief, and it is meant to enlighten humanity. And this is quite a long time ago, 1977, but lots of relevant stuff are checkable, which I read in previous chapters, and so this morning I feel compelled to read another hour or so. Well, you have to read the end of chapter 6 from the previous upload. So, they have problems with understanding really that what they are doing in meditation is so important. And Tom, who speaks for the Council of Nine, finishes in the last chapter saying, "We understand what you mean," Tom said, "but you spend no time and patience to feel. And we would ask you to remember, it is not action always that is necessary. Being is necessary." This Warsaw communication session was suddenly terminated when the telephone rang in the room in the hotel in which they were holding it. Andrija answered, but nobody spoke, although he was aware of somebody on the other end of the line for a few seconds before the connection was broken. "They must be checking on us," he said, and returned to continue the communication. But Tom was no longer there, and he had to bring Phyllis out of trance, back to consciousness. They didn't have an opportunity to ask Tom for an explanation of this event until the following day, when they held their first session in their hotel in Ankara. 1974 this is. The journey from Poland to Turkey gave rise to other experiences that they were also anxious to ask Tom about. A suitcase of Andrija's disappeared for an hour at the airport. Phyllis had seen it on the trolley coming from the plane, but it didn't turn up in the collection area. When Andrija reported it missing, he had to wait an hour before it was brought by a porter who spoke no English and who appeared with it from the opposite end of the building to the arrival area. When John noticed a man at the airport who he suspected was observing them, and his suspicion increased when he saw the same man later in the hotel. Could some authorities be taking an interest in their movement? It seemed a preposterous idea, but although their mission was essentially non-political, and they were not taking sides in the Middle Eastern situation, they were aware that if their activities were known, it might not seem that way to the respective government authorities. They tended to have different views as to the degree of official interest in them, and consequently how they should behave. And these differences were a part of the interpersonal difficulties, problems and tension that further heightened the drama of this trip. Tom confirmed their suspicions in the first Ankara communication. He said that the break in communication in the Warsaw Hotel was because a bugging device had been activated, and if what had transpired had been recorded, you would have had great difficulty in explaining. They were reproached for being careless in conversation. "When you assume that all around you understand you not, you are assuming an error." John asked when and where they had erred, and Tom answered, "In places of consumption," which reminded them that they had talked about the work in the dining room in the hotel in Warsaw, and that twice there had been a man sitting alone at a table nearby. Their suspicion that the contents of Andrija's suitcase had been examined at the airport was correct, but nothing had been found. Part of the reason they were regarded with suspicion was that they had been behaving sufficiently like tourists, and now they should spend an extra day in Ankara taking pains to look and act like tourists. They should remain together at all times and be careful what they said in public places, but they would be able to speak freely in the hotel room. Meanwhile, they could continue their good work of diffusing the explosive political situation. On the present state of play in a war game, Tom reported, Soviet Russia has not bowed to your nation, Doctor. They will go to a point, but not beyond that point, and at this time they are considering the possibility of doing it themselves and saying that your nation had done it. It's important that the power that the three of you generate negates the Soviet Russia's thinking. It is also of the utmost important that you be in Israel, not later than the 24th of November 1974. Andrija asked what they would be able to do in Israel, since it seemed that all the important decisions were being made elsewhere, and Tom answered, "It is through your energy that the leaders of Israel will be given the strength to make the proper decision and proper negotiations without giving their souls." The plan to interrupt television and radio transmission during the period 18th to the 22nd November 74 was still on. They learned and would be carried out whatever the international situation was at the time. Speaking for the civilization that is handling that project, Tom said, it may not be with the fullest of force, but it will be the beginning. Also, it might afford an opportunity to alert the people of the world to what their governments had in mind. We are already, in effect, overriding at this time with experiments, he told them. As if to demonstrate the fact, Andrija's radio, which throughout the communication had remained tuned and silent on the specified frequency, began, just as the session was coming to a close, to emit curious noises, a cacophony of sounds made by musical instruments with a cornet predominant. "Is that Ultimus sound?" John asked. "Yes, they are testing," Tom said. And to listen to the tape today and hear that pat response made one ask again the question, is he truth-teller or opportunist? The sounds are certainly unlike anything one would expect to hear on a radio, even in the Middle East. Rather like a brass band frenziedly tuning up in the middle of a battlefield. But to paraphrase Shakespeare's Prospero, the air is full of noises, and, as Coué demonstrated, men are infinitely suggestible. The extra day at Ankara afforded John and Andrija the leisure and opportunity to take a look at certain problems that they felt were undermining their efficiency in the work. In the second session, they discussed these problems with Tom, and the discussion, which lasted an hour, is interesting, both as evidence of Tom's insight and for the light it throws on the relationship and interpersonal problems of Phyllis, Andrija, and John at this time. I will have to summarize it briefly in the present context, and such a summary will not convey so strongly as does listening to the tape of the discussion, with all its give and take and repetition, the impressive way that Tom, by means of Socratic questioning and analysis, obliged John and Andrija fundamentally to change their view of the situation. The situation, as they first saw it, was that Phyllis was causing them problems by being moody and sometimes appearing reluctant to work, and as she had told Andrija some days ago that she was lonely, he suggested that things might be better if she had her husband with her. This is not true, Tom said, but Andrija argued that it must be, because Phyllis herself had said that she was lonely. You understand not, Tom said categorically. So John had a go and explained that recently Phyllis had come to need more attention than formerly. She was like a child, and when it came to work she was always finding reasons to postpone it or do it in a different way. You are reading into the situation things that are not there, Tom said. Look within your own hearts, the two of you. Andrija did and admitted that he'd had the same problem to an extent and would feel better if he had an emotional companion on these trips, and he asked if it might not help alleviate some of their interpersonal strains and tensions if they travelled with such a companions. Tom professed not to understand the question, and Andrija had to spell it out in different terms before Tom said he would consult. While he was consulting, John told Andrija that he didn't feel quite the same as he did about it, and Andrija said, I don't particularly need to know what, but there is this emotional thing in the air all the time. And when Tom, having consulted, asked how they thought the presence of others would affect the work, he repeated, that he thought it would help by preventing ridiculous emotional problems arising all the time. Whose are the emotional problems? Tom asked. Well, both John and I feel that it's the being, Phyllis. In what manner? She's lonely, she says so. You are creating the problem. You understand not. I'm sorry, but you are wrong. She told me herself that that's her problem. She gets upset because of being lonely and takes it out in little ways on us. Tom, and you have no knowledge of doing the same? And Andrija was becoming exasperated. He said, I don't feel lonely. That's not my problem. And I think we're getting into an impasse here. This isn't very elevated. Tom said calmly, you are correct, but you do not understand. I don't think you're trying to understand us, and I don't know why. Tom, we understand what is inside. Now, would you speak, Sir John? After this exchange, in which Andrija's exasperation came close to turning to anger, John tried to be conciliatory and reasonable. He said that part of Phyllis' problem was probably that he and Andrija didn't give her all the support they could, and that they could try to help her in future by being closer and more supportive. But Tom wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted them to examine the question whether the central problem really was Phyllis's loneliness. With regard to the work, Andrija said he felt that the problem was her lack of enthusiasm and unwillingness to accept all the responsibilities the work entailed. For instance, when they tried to play her the tapes of the communications, her mind tended to wander, as if she didn't really want to face what the tapes said. John supported this interpretation, saying, yes, there's this reluctance. She says she will always work, but many times she's rather morose before she does, and I don't understand that. Tom said bluntly, you understand not communication. The doctor should. Had she, he asked, ever refused to work or go somewhere required by the work? They had to admit that she never actually refused. And do you understand it is important for many things not to be in the mind of the being? He said, implying that this was the reason for Phyllis's unwillingness to listen attentively to the tapes. This too they had to admit. So, what was the problem? John said, I think it is the situation of the relationship between the three of us that is the problem. Andrija answered, who has created it? One or the others, or all three? Andrija said undoubtedly all three of them had personal problems, but he thought that he and John were more successful in keeping them out of the work than Phyllis was. There have been times, Doctor, when you have involved yourself and have created problems, and we have not chastised you for it. Andrija and then John in turn had to admit that this was true. Tom proceeded to demolish the theory that the root cause of the trouble was lack of emotional companionship, forcing them to contemplate what it would be like if their respective partners were with them on this trip, and to admit that in that situation there would be nothing but trouble. Then he said, may we bring into the open what is the core of the problem? I wish you would, Andrija said. The one who is most unbalanced is the one who is the balance. Said John, have you looked within? Have you understood it is your frustration that have created the problems? Suddenly transported as if it were from the jury box to the dock, John was defenseless. He listened as Tom gave examples from his recent conduct of how he frequently got frustrated because the others, Andrija as well as Phyllis, did not do things as he thought they should be done, or at the time he wanted them to be done, and how these frustrations built up into resentment, which Phyllis felt and was affected by. There was nothing that John could deny or defend. He was chastened. He could only say, I'm sorry, but I think you know that my motivation is that I'm trying always to do the right thing, to help the work. Tom persisted, "You are not the only one who is trying. All three are trying, and all three have frustrations, and no one is better than another. You say you must treat the being as a child, but part of the reason you have a problem is because you treat her as a child. You must treat each other as equals, not even as man or woman, because this is not the nature of the three of you. Do you understand?" "Yes, I do," John said, and thanked Tom for his insight and his counsel. "There are things that are going to be very difficult in the next 2 years, Tom said in conclusion, "and if you cannot deal with this now, how will you deal with those?" Andrija said that he was sure that with Tom's continuing help and guidance, they would be able to deal with their interpersonal problems and maintain the harmonious balance of the triangle, which they all understood was essential to the work. In spite of their problems and very human failings, they were, according to Tom, succeeding in their apparently superhuman mission. En route from Ankara to Tehran, they unobtrusively held their meditation session in the transit lounge at Beirut Airport, and in the next communication they held, Tom told them, "What we have asked you to do, you have done, and let us assure you that though you may not see or feel or think that there are any effects, there truly are, because you see not a tangible result, you understand not. Because you see not a tangible result, you understand not." They had succeeded in preventing a Russian-American conspiracy, but they had still to negate the Soviet Russians of their intent. Their influence was working to that effect, and from their present situation it was also spreading to the south and west and affecting the Arab leaders. Moreover, a little influence in Iran itself was not going to go amiss, for the country was going to play an increasingly important part as a balancing influence in the Middle East in the future. The Shah of Iran, Tom predicted, will become a strong and very important spokesman in deterring, though not at this time. They spent 2 nights in Tehran before setting out on the last leg of their journey, which would take them to Copenhagen via Moscow. They had not had time to obtain visas for Russia before leaving New York, but Tom had stressed that it was important that they should at least pass through the Russian capital. So they had scheduled the journey so that they had 4 hours in Moscow airport in transit. There were only 4 or 5 other passengers on the Iran Air Boeing 707 from Tehran to Moscow, so Andrija conceived the idea of taking the opportunity of the relative privacy to attempt to hold a communication. They waited until they had seen Mount Arafat on the left side of the plane, and they were flying at 35,000 feet above southern Russia when they established contact with Tom. "We wish to speak in another language," was the first thing he said, and proceeded to utter a few phrases of musical chanting. He then explained, "Tom, you are close to your homeland, and we wish that all adjustments were in order so we could speak to you in the original." Recalling in the earlier occasion when he had heard that chanting language, Andrija understood that by his homeland, Tom meant the Tarim Basin, and he asked if he could now tell them more about the civilization of Aksu. "Doctor, you were one of the founders," Tom answered, "and you are now coming full circle. You are now one of the savers. Remember," said John, "that you carried on the thoughts and service of the founders, as this being did at a later time." As conditions were not favorable for a prolonged communication, Tom changed the subject, giving them instructions as to what they should do in Moscow. He concluded with a shrewd comment on the Russian mind that I quoted in chapter 1, see page 13. Then Phyllis came out of trance and described a place she had visited during her trance. There was something in the clay that made it shine. There was something in the clay there that made it shine. And there were all kinds of birds, symbols of some sort, all kinds of birds. The singing, it was fantastic. I can't describe it. It was like talking in levels. And there were hundreds of people, and they were singing, and it was like they were singing a hosanna. It was beautiful. In earlier communications, John and Andrija had learned that the original language of Aksu was a tonal language, which would sound like singing, and that had the predominant symbology of the civilization that featured birds. So Phyllis's description was consistent both with this earlier information and with the content of the communication that it followed. Arriving in Moscow, they tried to get a special dispensation to tour the city in the company of an inter-tourist guide, but were refused. They had to spend the hours between flights in the transit lounge and do their meditation there. They found a quiet corner of the cafeteria, and as they were undisturbed, John suggested, when they had completed, that they might attempt a second communication of the day under unusual circumstances. So as not to be too conspicuous, they did not record this session, which was a short one. But later in the day, they recorded the fact that it had contained one thing of significance. Tom had said that there was an assassination plot underway, aimed at the PLO leader Yasser Arafat, and that they should meditate at 3 o'clock New York time in order to prevent it. The prescribed time fitted well into their day's schedule, for it fell short after they had settled into a hotel in Copenhagen in the evening. Shortly afterwards, they held another communication and obtained a longer explanation of the Arafat situation. Tom informed them. A meeting was arranged for the leader Arafat to view installations of a military nature. There were to be journalists and different nations, and the plan was to have a conference, and when the photographs were to be taken, this would be the time. The conference is still in progress. There are 2 that have been pulled out because of previous knowledge, and that, in effect, is what you have done. This is the kind of information that should be checkable if one had access to the relevant records. From the newspapers, all I have been able to ascertain is that Yasser Arafat was in Cuba on this day, 15th November 1974. He had been in the news all the week, because 2 days before he had made a speech to the United Nations Assembly in New York, in which he had accused Israel of preparing for a 5th war in the Middle East. On the 14th November 74, he had flown to Cuba to spend 2 or 3 days, and it's certainly likely that his program there would have included a press conference and a viewing of military installations, as Tom said. Reviewing the past week, Tom went on to say, "Your project has been successful. The Russians are no longer inclined to become involved. They have become more stable, and truly now, because of your trip, they are considering going forward with their own nation and the nations they control. There have been leadership problems, but they are stabilizing, and they have also realized that they may be the goat. They like to be the bear, and they would not like to be the goat." The journey had also been a learning experience for the 3 of them. In reviewing the past 8 of your days, you will find that, beside the work which you have accomplished, there have been many things within you which you have mastered. And they had learned about the energy that they could channel, and how doubts and negative thoughts could undermine a project. This was a thing they should never forget, and in the coming months they were going to have many demonstrations of the effect of their positive thinking. There was still a need for them to be in Israel the following week, because by being in that area you will not only stabilize the leaders of Israel, but also put a damper on the Arab leaders. But during the following week they should be, as originally planned, back or sinning in the States for the experiments in television intervention. It was early on Sunday morning, 17th November, that John and Andrija and Phyllis arrived back at Ossining. They did not see the following day's issue of the London Times, though they would have been amused and perhaps gratified if they had, for it carried on its front page the headlines, "Threat of New Middle East War Recedes." On the face of it, the idea of communicating to the people of the world by using their radio and television networks would appear a most efficient way for an extraterrestrial civilization to get its message across. Being capable of interstellar travel should not, we imagine, have any difficulty with the technology such intervention would require. This, however, may be an unwarranted assumption, because we can form no conception of either technology. We cannot assume that command over the one must imply an equally faculty in the other. That would be illogical. But of course, men are often illogical, particularly with regard to matters in which they have invested faith, love, or money. And it is understandable that after all that had happened in the past weeks, Andrija and John were eager to have some visible and irrefutable evidence of the reality of the intelligences and the forces that they were trafficking with. Tom had cautioned them about expecting too much. Ultima says you think he is what in your world you call a magician. He is a refined technician, and he is a perfectionist, but he is not a magician, and he does not want to blow out the being, Phyllis. Nevertheless, they returned to Assinning expecting something like a miracle. When they were in Ankara, Tom had told them that the communications transmission project could not be initiated with the fullest of force. Andrija took up the point in a couple of days later in Tehran and asked, "Is it not possible somehow to make a stronger showing during our communications initiation on the 18th to the 22nd of November, 74, in such a way that men's minds will be taken off war and will begin seriously to wonder about your presence and possibly coming to Earth?" Tom answered, "We understand what you are speaking about, and we wish we could help. We wish there was the power to help. Remember that when we sent you Uri Geller, this was a primitive power and a power that could do many things. But then there was the problem with Uri. Then we sent you Bobby, and we had the same difficulty. And so this being, Phyllis, and the two of you were willing to be used. But the work that had been done on this being for many years was not in the field of what we are now attempting to do. This, you must understand, it is a different power from the power we originally planned. We can put power through this being of that nature, but it could create a problem for the physical body to the extent that we would no longer have a being. The point behind this, and behind the earlier mention of the danger of a blowout, is that Phyllis was to function as the main channel for the energies required for the communication transmissions. When transmission was being attempted, she was to sit in the Faraday cage, wired up to Andrija's electronic equipment, and all three of them were to meditate in order to focus the required energies. They did this 3 times daily for the 4 days from the 19th to the 22nd of November 74 inclusive, and all the time Andrija kept his radio tuned and connected to the tape recorder so that if anything came through they would have to record it. Nothing did. On 21st November they had the television programs on channel 9 and 3 videotaped between 2:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon, because they had been told that an attempt would be made to communicate on those channels at that time. But again, nothing happened. It seemed that the entire project had been a failure, and at the end of this period, Tom admitted that it had been in most areas. But nevertheless, Ultima was satisfied, because the experiment had been successful in 27% of the areas in which it had been attempted, and only regretted that these didn't include the area monitored by the group at Assinning. "He says that you, as a scientist, will understand," Tom reported to Andrija, adding that after this moderately successful first attempt, Ultima and his unit would continue working at the technical difficulties. Even in the areas where intervention had been successful, they had not succeeded in creating any effect that would start people asking questions. They had accomplished only short blackouts and faint superimpositions of images alien to the program, irregularities that viewers could shrug off as technical faults. Ultima clearly had a great deal to learn before his technology awakened the world to his and his colleagues' existence. The project had first been mentioned in the course of the communications held in the Bahamas in June 74, and since then Andrija and John had built up great expectations around it, and though Tom had on several occasions told them about the problems involved and how Phyllis was really too sensitive a channel for the rather primitive energies that the project necessitated, they were disappointed that the results of the 18th to 22nd November series of experiments were not more positive and evidential. One of the sessions held over these 4 days consisted of an hour-long and very impressive lecture that Tom addressed to his terrestrial colleagues. The 9, he said, were disturbed by certain directions that their conduct and their thoughts were taking, and it was necessary to repeat and clarify a few points. Tom speaks. We have told you before that zeal is futile. It is of great importance that this be understood, and especially by you, Sir John. And it is of importance, and we speak to the 3 of you here now, that you do not think of yourselves as special. You have a special function, but it does not relieve you of the problems of the physical plane, or give you a special dispensation to remove yourself from the affairs of the physical world. Your purpose is to help the physical world, and for that you must exist on the physical plane. What we have asked of you is that you balance it. There is no way you can help people if you understand them not. If you understand not the joys, the fears, the sadness, the despairs, the loves, and the angers of people that exist in a physical world. In truth, you are to master these things, but a person does not master them by escaping from them. A person masters them by existing amongst them. If you remove yourself from the physical world, you have no temptation. You have no anger, you have no joy, and you have no love. And by removing, yes, you can master these things, because there is no temptation, and there is no touching of other things. The most important of all, it is ego that must be dealt with. And all 3 of you have difficulty with that. Remember this, for the 3 of you to come as far as you have, it was important to have an ego. And it is still important. We do not ask you to be egoless, because if you were, you would not have character. But it is important to be balanced and to exist in the world and to realize that you are not more important than any other. None of you is the perfect being, but each of you has qualities that, blended together, make a perfect thing. And when you understand not each other, how can you understand the world that you are trying to raise the consciousness of? Remember, you cannot escape your destiny. You can truly only turn around and walk towards it. And the destiny of the 3 of you is to be involved with the peoples of the world to help them. The directness, the pertinence, and the eloquence of this pep talk impressed both John and Andrija. If Ultima had limitations as a technician, Tom made up for them by possessing in good measure those other attributes expected of superhuman beings, wisdom and insight. Indeed, it is largely on account of these latter qualities that the trio have kept faith over the years, and that I undertook this chronicle, considering it not unworthy of the attention of serious readers. 2 other passages from this long speech of Tom's are worth recording. The first for the light it throws on one of the most problematic themes of the communications, and the second for its wisdom and a nice touch of invention that it contains. The first has bearing on the problem posed by the previous lives' material. The previous lives' materials. We speak of the time in your lives when the three of you were beings together. In the first communication, when we told you who you were, in your mind you asked the question because you were convinced that you could not have been who we told you you were. Because it was not of great importance then, we simply said that in truth it was so. Do you recall that conversation? It is important now that the three of you review that which is written of your past lives. If you do, it will give you greater understanding of what is important. The previous lives material is difficult and embarrassing because it seems to polarize the possibilities. Either you accept it as literally true, or you dismiss it as a monumental ego trip, which would of course put the authenticity of the material of all the rest of the communications in doubt. This passage suggests another way of regarding the previous lives material, as symbolically true, as an instructional aid, a way of directing their attention to the characteristics and possibilities pertaining to their present lives, which leaves open the possibility that the intelligence producing the information exists independently of the three of them. While we are on the subject of previous lives, one other piece of information divulged by Tom in this speech should be noted. They had not always incarnated as figures of extraordinary distinction, but had each lived many obscure lives. We understood not the physical world, and you did not either, and so you lived many times to try to understand, and although you are pure soul, each time you lived on the physical planet, you are open to be trapped by it. The second passage for the record was addressed to Andrija and referred to a conversation earlier in the day at which most of the household had been present. I will now speak to the doctor. In your speech to the group of your people, when you explained that all of your people had been gods or goddesses, this was an error. You cannot speak to people in that manner, for when you do, they begin to believe that they are special. And the problem of the physical world has always been the people who think that they are special. It is only in humility that the people of the physical planet Earth can grow and understand. Andrija acknowledged the justice of this, but asked, is there any other term that might be more appropriate and accurate so that these people might understand just a wee bit? Tom answered promptly, would you be satisfied with the term messengers of the eons? Because in truth that is what they are. Yes, that's beautiful, Andrija said. And so to Israel, where the greater part of the sequel of this story takes place. When Andrija, John and Phyllis arrived in Tel Aviv on the 24th of November 1974, they had specific instructions from the management to be out of the country by the 11th December, because if they stayed longer, they might be in danger. None of them had any idea at that time how prolonged and complex their relation to Israel would become. To contemplate the various strands that relate the trio and their work in Israel is to be persuaded of the validity of the Jungian theory of synchronicity. Ostensibly, they first went there because Israel was the potential flashpoint for a war situation which could engulf the whole world. But Andrija had worked there before with Uri Geller, who, of course, is an Israeli. And the Israeli people, according to Tom, were genetically related to the space people, particularly those of the civilization of Hoover. Also, Israel had been the place where the last attempt to upgrade human consciousness had been made, through the agency of the Nazarene, Jesus Christ, and the stress in the teachings of Tom on the importance of humility, love and service is reminiscent of Christian beliefs, just as a great deal of the symbolism and some of the dramatic themes of the communications are reminiscent of esoteric Christianity and Judaism, of the Book of Revelation and the Kabbalah. Israel brings into force, interrelates and catalyzes many of the disparate themes of the communication, so much so that one is tempted to speculate that the trios being drawn there when they were, at the time, when their work needed to be given focus, direction and coherence, was not as fortuitous but a synchronistic event. Andrija had had problems with the Israel immigration and customs authorities before. When he last left Israel, he had had all the notes, research documents and tape transcripts of his work with Yuri confiscated for some time. Now, when he presented his passport, the immigration officer called another over and they went into a huddle for a couple of minutes before returning it to him. His arrival had been noticed. He wondered how it would have been if Yuri had been with them. Some days before, Tom had said that it would be advantageous for Yuri to join the party. Andrija had phoned him, and at first he had said he would try and arrange it, but at the last minute he had backed down. They had reserved a 2-room suite at the Sheraton, a tall modern hotel overlooking the Mediterranean at the northern end of Tel Aviv, and they made this their base during the 3 weeks of their stay, using a hired car to get around the country and generally looking and behaving like tourists. According to Tom, in the first communications they held, there was no need for dissimulation, because the Israeli authorities were aware of their presence and some of the leaders knew their true missions and were grateful to them. But they could be in danger from other factions and should be particularly cautious on the 28th, the 29th and the 30th of November. They could begin their work, he said, by spending a day driving around Tel Aviv. This would spread a pacifying influence in this time of high tension. We are now in a time of war, Tom said. A greater war has never happened, and when we say this, we do not mean just on your planet Earth, but we mean in the surroundings, and in the heavens, and in the universe. He was referring to Armageddon, the cosmic conflict of the biblical end of days period, in which Earth's present troubles were but the microscopic reflection. Motoring around the streets of Tel Aviv seemed to Andrija, Phyllis and John a modest way of contributing to the war effort, but for their second day, the management came up with a rather more dramatic situation. In a state of waking consciousness, Phyllis got some figures, which seemed like map coordinates. Andrija went out and bought a map, and when they checked the coordinates on it, they found that they indicated Yavne, Y-A-V-N-E-H, which is the site of one of Israel's nuclear power stations, about 20 miles south of Tel Aviv. In the communication, they asked Tom if there was any significance in Phyllis getting these coordinates, and he said that there was, for a sabotage plot would have very serious consequences had been formulated, and it would be their task to help frustrate it by spending 30 minutes in meditation as near as possible to Yavne. So they drove down the coast and sought a suitable spot where they might meditate without being too conspicuous. The power station area was enclosed by a tall barbed wire. The roads around it were patrolled by security vehicles, and there was a low flying helicopter overhead, and they had to settle for a place some 4 or 5 miles from Yavne for their meditation. After about 20 minutes, Phyllis said that Ultima had told her that they could go now, and she described what she had seen. The dematerialization of the core of a tube, which she presumed was an explosive device of some sort. So when they held their evening communication in the hotel, Andrija's first question was, what did we accomplish at Yavne? And Tom answered, a complete diffusing. During this period, Phyllis again became vulnerable to psychic attack when she was coming out of trance, perhaps because she no longer had the protection of the Faraday cage. She also became very visionary during the meditation sessions, getting imagery that seemed incomprehensible but which Tom could usually elucidate on. During one meditation, she kept seeing 4 umbrellas. Tom explained that as they didn't have the cage, it would be beneficial for them to use umbrellas during their communications because the metal frames could help concentrate energies and afford protection. He said, It is sad that there is not amongst all the possessions of your world a copper umbrella, but suggested that the lack may be compensated by placing something of copper on the open umbrella. So the next day they bought umbrellas and thereafter used them as Tom had suggested, attaching them to the backs of the upright chairs they sat in for communication in order to keep their hands free. If the Israeli authority were, as Tom had said, keeping an eye on them, and if one of their agents had caught a glimpse of them sitting hour after hour in a darkened room in the Sheraton under open umbrellas, while the woman pointed her 2 index finger at the other 2 and talked in a strange voice, they would surely have been dismissed as a group of crazy American cultists. They themselves often joked and laughed as they made their preparations, imagining how they would appear to others. But the umbrellas and the copper bracelets really did seem to improve communications and minimize attacks. In another meditation, Phyllis got a very strange sequence of images. It started with birds, large and colourful bedecked birds. They're coming from North Bravna. That word's very clear, she said. The birds swooped down to where people were signing a paper with a quill pen. I don't know if the paper is a surrender of peace or a peace treaty, Phyllis said. Then she saw scenes of savagery and wanton murder, the beheading of women and children, performed by men wielding curved swords and wearing ornamented robes. There was some connection between the men and the swooping birds, and perched on a wall were a number of eagles, just watching. They could quite easily stop the marauding birds, but they didn't move. The name North Bavna kept coming back. Where was North Bavna? She asked. Neither Andrija nor John knew, but Andrija suggested that the savage killers she saw were Saracens, and she was seeing a replay of his historical events. Did the Saracens ever take the city of Jerusalem? Phyllis asked, and Andrija was able to tell her that they had done so at the time of the Crusades. Well, that's what they are going to try to do this time, Phyllis said. I think I finished this here on page 202, chapter 6, second part 3 to follow soon.